In Mount Holly, North Carolina, a young mother spent years fighting a body that seemed to betray her without warning. Her heart slowed dangerously. Her blood pressure collapsed. Doctors ran test after test and found nothing they could explain. Each episode looked random. Each recovery felt temporary. And each time, her husband was there, calm, capable, medically trained. When 32-year-old woman was found unresponsive on her couch one September evening, no one initially questioned what had happened. She had a pacemaker, she had a long medical history, and her death was ruled natural almost immediately. But behind that diagnosis was a detail no one noticed at first. Her illness had never been natural at all. It had been administered quietly, deliberately, and repeatedly hidden in something as ordinary as eye drops. This is the story of Stacy Hunsucker. Stacy grew up in North Carolina, surrounded by family, faith, and routine. She was known as warm, creative, and deeply devoted to the people she loved. After graduating high school, she earned a degree in paralegal studies and worked in law offices before discovering what truly fulfilled her was teaching young children. She eventually married Joshua Hunsucker, her high school sweetheart. To those around them, their relationship looked steady and familiar, built on years of shared history. They raised 2 daughters together, Piper and Willow, and settled into what appeared to be a quiet, stable family life. Joshua worked as a flight paramedic, a job that carried authority and trust. He was trained to recognize medical emergencies, administer medication, and respond under pressure. Friends admired his confidence. Stacy stayed home with their children, managing the household and remaining deeply involved in church and community life. No one suspected that the person trained to save lives was slowly dismantling one. Inside the home, the roles were clearly defined as Joshua was seen as the protector, the professional, the one who understood medicine when others did not. Stacy was the caregiver, the constant presence in her children's lives, the steady center of the family. That dynamic created an imbalance no one questioned because it looked ordinary and safe. When concerns arose, Joshua's medical background often ended the conversation before it could begin. His explanations sounded informed. His reassurances carried weight. And in a household where trust was assumed, expertise became authority. From the outside, there was nothing to challenge. No visible chaos, no raised alarms. Just a family moving forward, supported by faith, routine, and the belief that the people closest to you are the ones least likely to cause harm. That belief would become the foundation of everything that followed. In 2013, shortly after the birth of their first daughter, Stacy began experiencing unexplained medical episodes. Her heart rate dropped suddenly. Her blood pressure plunged. She felt weak, dizzy, and disoriented, which made the doctors puzzled. The symptoms came and went without warning. Tests revealed nothing conclusive. There was no family history of heart disease. Still, the episodes grew more severe. Each hospital visit ended the same way. Concern without answers, discharge without clarity, and a growing sense that something fundamental was being missed. After the birth of their second daughter, Stacy's condition worsened dramatically. She was admitted to the intensive care unit with dangerously low vitals. At one point, her heart stopped completely. She survived, but the doctors made a startling decision that Stacy, still in her 20s, would need a pacemaker. To everyone involved, it appeared tragic but unavoidable. Her heart, they believed, was failing. What no one realized was that her body was reacting exactly as it would if it were being poisoned. The medical pattern was there, quietly repeating itself. Sudden collapses followed by temporary recoveries. Heart rhythms that dipped without explanation. Blood pressure that dropped as if a switch had been flipped. These were not progressive symptoms. They were episodic, appearing sharply, then fading, leaving behind confusion rather than diagnosis. Specialists ran cardiac tests. Neurological causes were considered. Autoimmune disorders were ruled out. Each new theory collapsed under scrutiny. Nothing fully explained why a young, otherwise healthy woman with no genetic risk factors kept returning to the edge of cardiac failure. And yet, one explanation was never considered, not because it was impossible, but because it was unthinkable. Poisoning was not on the table, as Stacy had no access to dangerous substances. There was no evidence of self-harm, and the idea that someone inside her home might be causing her decline was beyond the scope of what doctors were trained to suspect. Even more crucially, the substance responsible would not have appeared on routine toxicology screens. It mimicked natural cardiac dysfunction. It hid behind symptoms that made medical sense, if you didn't know what to look for. Each hospital stay added another piece to a medical history that appeared increasingly fragile. Each unexplained emergency made her sudden death feel more plausible. And without realizing it, a narrative was being built, one that would later be used to explain away the unexplainable. By the time Stacy left the hospital with a pacemaker implanted, the danger had not passed. It had simply become invisible. The illness still did not make sense, but it was never supposed to. Years later, investigators would identify the real cause of Stacy's symptoms was tetrahydrozoline, a chemical found in common over-the-counter eye drops. When used properly, it reduces redness. When ingested, it slows the heart, drops blood pressure, and can cause cardiac arrest. The substance is notoriously difficult to detect. Even standard toxicology screens do not test for it. The symptoms mimic natural illness, especially heart conditions. To doctors, it looks like a failing heart. To medical charts, it looks like bad luck, while to an untrained eye, it looks like tragedy. But Joshua knew everything going on, because as a paramedic, he understood dosages, effects, and timing. He knew how the drug interacted with the cardiovascular system. He knew that swallowed tetrahydrozoline could suppress heart rate and blood pressure without leaving obvious forensic traces. Most importantly, he knew how to give just enough to harm without killing, but to destabilize. That knowledge changed everything. Investigators would later argue that the poison was never meant to cause immediate death. It was meant to weaken Stacy slowly, to create a documented medical history that made her body appear unreliable, fragile, and prone to failure. Each hospital visit reinforced that narrative. Each unexplained episode made her eventual collapse seem not suspicious, but expected. For years, Stacy's illness followed a pattern that now looks chillingly intentional. Sudden declines, unexplained recoveries, and escalating severity. The timing was irregular, but strategic. The symptoms were dramatic, but survivable. And every episode deepened the belief that Stacy's heart, not an outside force, was the problem. What made tetrahydrozoline especially effective was its accessibility. It required no prescription, which raised no alarms because a bottle of eye drops did not look like a weapon. It blended seamlessly into everyday life, hiding in medicine cabinets and bathroom drawers, passed over without a second thought. And because the poison was administered orally, not intravenously, there were no injection sites, no obvious trauma, no immediate red flags. The method relied entirely on trust, the assumption that nothing dangerous could come from something so ordinary. By the time Stacy's condition reached its most critical stage, the groundwork had already been laid. Her medical file told a story of a woman whose heart had betrayed her repeatedly. When she collapsed, it would not look like murder. It would look like the inevitable conclusion of years of unexplained illness. The poison had done more than damage to her body, and had rewritten the story of her health almost perfectly. On September 23, 2018, Joshua called 911 and reported that he had found his wife unresponsive on the couch. When they arrived, Stacy was already gone, and resuscitation efforts failed almost immediately. Joshua's account of what he had been doing before discovering her body shifted repeatedly. To the police, he said one thing. To friends, he said another. To his mother-in-law, he gave an entirely different version. At times, he claimed he had stepped outside. Other times, he said he had been working nearby, or walking around the property. Each explanation contradicted the last. The inconsistencies stood out, but they were overlooked. Stacy's medical history seemed to explain everything. Years of unexplained heart problems, a pacemaker, multiple hospitalizations. To first responders and local investigators, her death appeared tragic but natural. There were no visible signs of struggle, no forced entry, and no immediate evidence of foul play. Stacy's death was attributed to cardiac arrest. No autopsy was performed. Despite Stacy being a registered organ donor, Joshua refused further examination. The decision raised little resistance at the time. As her husband, he had the legal authority to decline, and he exercised it decisively. Within days, her body was cremated. The speed was striking. There was no pause for further review, no second look, no opportunity for later testing. Whatever answers might have existed within her body were reduced to ash. Then came the insurance claims. Within 48 hours, Joshua filed paperwork to collect $250,000 in life insurance benefits. He was the sole beneficiary. The timing was rapid, especially considering the shock of a sudden death. While family members were still processing their grief, legal and financial processes were already underway. To those close to Stacy, something felt wrong. The lack of hesitation, the refusal of an autopsy, the urgency to finalize everything. But at the time, there was no investigation to receive those concerns. No official reason to question a man whose wife had died with a documented heart condition. On paper, the case was closed, but in reality, it was only just beginning. In the months that followed, those close to the family noticed something unsettling. Joshua did not grieve. He did not speak about Stacy. He did not share memories of her with their children, or acknowledge her absence in the way loved ones usually do. There were no stories, no reflections, no visible signs of loss. Instead, he moved on quickly. Within months, a new girlfriend became a constant presence in the home Stacy had once filled. She appeared openly, not quietly or cautiously, but confidently attending family events, spending time with the children, and stepping into a life that had barely cooled from tragedy. To those watching from the outside, the transition felt abrupt and deeply uncomfortable. Then vacations followed. Photos surfaced of trips that would have been financially impossible just a year earlier, when medical bills dominated the household. Large purchases appeared, including an expensive boat valued in the tens of thousands of dollars. At the same time, the crushing medical debt that had once defined the family's reality vanished. Mortgages were paid down. Financial pressure disappeared almost overnight. Joshua rarely mentioned Stacy. He did not express longing. He did not revisit shared milestones. Babysitters, co-workers, and friends later describe him as upbeat, energized, and focused on the future and not the past. To Stacy's mother, Susie Robinson, the pieces no longer fit. She replayed everything in her mind. The refusal of an autopsy, the rushed cremation, the speed of the insurance claims, and the years of unexplained illness that doctors could never explain. The memories would not settle. They stacked on top of one another, forming a pattern she could no longer ignore. Susie remembered how often her daughter had been sick, how often she had nearly died, how none of it had ever made sense. And now, with Stacy one, Joshua appeared not broken, but relieved. 9 months after Stacy's death, Susie contacted the North Carolina Department of Insurance and reported suspected fraud. That call alone changed everything. Because Stacy had been an organ donor, a vial of her blood had been preserved before cremation, a routine medical safeguard that no one, least of all Joshua, seemed to consider. That single sample became the only remaining piece of Stacy that could still speak for her. Investigators quietly sent it for specialized toxicology testing, requesting screens far beyond what is normally run in suspected natural deaths. The results were unmistakable. Stacy's blood contained tetrahydrozoline at levels dozens of times higher than therapeutic exposure. These were not trace amounts. They were not consistent with accidental ingestion or misuse. The concentrations pointed to repeated, deliberate poisoning over time, which is enough to weaken her heart, disrupt her blood pressure, and eventually stop it altogether. Toxicologists explained that the substance would have been nearly impossible to detect without specifically searching for it. It was invisible to standard testing, designed to leave no obvious trail. In someone with a pacemaker and documented heart issues, the poison would blend seamlessly into an existing medical narrative. Her death would look natural. Investigators soon learned that Joshua had spoken openly about poisoning methods before Stacy's death. Even former co-workers recalled conversations in which he discussed how eye drops could be used to kill someone without detection. These were not vague comments or dark jokes. They were specific, technical statements made by a man with medical training who understood exactly how the body would respond. Those revelations shattered the remaining doubts. The case that once looked like a tragic medical mystery was now unmistakably homicide. Stacy's years of suffering were no longer random. Her hospitalizations were no longer unexplained. And her death was no longer a sudden failure of the heart. It was the final step in a plan that had been unfolding in plain sight for years. In December 2019, Joshua Hunsucker was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and insurance fraud. Prosecutors alleged that he had knowingly poisoned his wife and then attempted to profit from her death. Despite the severity of the charges, he was granted bond and released, a decision that would soon raise serious concerns. What followed only deepened those concerns. Rather than withdrawing or complying quietly with court restrictions, Joshua began a pattern of harassment aimed at Stacy's parents. He filmed them at public events involving their granddaughters. He followed them in his vehicle. He sent messages and packages demanding that they drop the case. Investigators later described the behavior as calculated intimidation, an attempt to silence the very people pushing for accountability. Then, in a move that stunned authorities, Joshua staged a fake kidnapping. He reported being assaulted, zip-tied, and injected with an unknown substance, claiming his father-in-law was responsible. Police investigated the claim thoroughly and found no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no corroboration. The story collapsed quickly. Detectives concluded the incident had been entirely fabricated, a desperate attempt to shift suspicion and reframed himself as a victim. Then came the most disturbing act of all. While free on bond, Joshua poisoned one of his own children using the same chemical found in Stacy's system. The child became seriously ill and required medical treatment. Tests confirmed exposure to tetrahydrozoline, along with another medication not approved for pediatric use. Medical staff flagged the case immediately, and authorities intervened to remove the children from his care. That act changed everything. Joshua's bond was revoked. He was taken back into custody, this time without the benefit of release. What had begun as a case centered on insurance fraud and a suspicious death had now expanded into a chilling pattern of behavior, one that showed his willingness to endanger even his own child in an effort to manipulate the narrative and avoid responsibility. By then, investigators no longer saw isolated crimes. They saw escalation. Stacy Hunsucker was not a woman with a failing heart. She was a devoted mother, a teacher, a daughter, and a friend whose trust was exploited by the person closest to her. Her death exposed a chilling truth that modern murder does not always require violence. Sometimes it hides behind medical charts, delayed diagnoses, and substances sold on grocery store shelves. This case is not just about greed or betrayal. It is about how knowledge can be weaponized, how systems can be manipulated, and how persistence, especially a mother's instinct, can uncover even the most carefully planned crime. If stories like Stacy's matter to you, stay with us. Share her story. Subscribe for more true crime documentaries, because silence is exactly what allows crimes like this to go unnoticed.